For today, we have an awesome speaker, Laura Klein. So she's at Laura Klein if you want to tweet her when we're tweeting tonight. She has a lot of great tweets and a lot of great posts at userknows.blogspot.com. That's her consultancy as well as where she blogs. And she's recently been blogging on Medium as well and getting a lot of traffic and has a lot of awesome articles there. She's an instructor at Tradecraft. I'll let her talk more about that when we sit down. She wrote the book that we were just talking about, UX for Lean Startups. It's a little confusing. There's two books with UX and Lean in the title from O'Reilly that look very similar. They came out around the same time. But hers is the one that looks like that. The orange one. All right, what color is the other one? Blue. Okay, orange. All right, cool. So, before doing what she's doing now, she was the director of product and UX at One Jackson, which got acquired by TaskRabbit. Before that, she was a senior interaction designer at InView, which is where Eric Ries worked. And before that, actually, I didn't know this, so I talked last time, she actually was a software engineer. So she's transitioned from engineering to UX, and she's also a Stanford alum. So, sometimes we'll have speakers, they'll give talks with slides. Today we're going to do a fireside chat and just talk. I have some questions prepared, and then we'll switch over to having the audience. So with that, let's give her a warm welcome, Laura Klein. All right, let me get this position. My questions? Do you have the questions I gave you?
All
right, cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. Always have a backup. Cool.
It means I don't get them.
Yeah,
So
well.
write the answers on there
Right.
for me.
Right, cool. All right, cool. So first and foremost, thank you so much for coming. I know you have a million things going on and are super busy. Oh, I got to turn this off so we
Because
have
otherwise
a
I feel like
spotlight going on. All right, cool. So thank you so much for coming.
You're more than welcome.
And I thought that, I gave an intro, but it'd be great just to hear, the one thing when we talked is you obviously were a developer and then became a designer. When we talked, it was obvious you have product management chops too. So I consider you a triple threat.
I can't do visual design though, so I can't call myself a unicorn.
Okay.
It makes me sad. Someday I keep telling myself I'll learn really good visual design,
Gotcha.
so then I can actually be a unicorn.
Okay, cool.
It will transform.
That sounds good. So maybe you can talk about how did your career evolve to get to this point of being like one of the top lean startup experts?
Every time I talk about this, I realize how long ago so much of it was, and that always makes me a little sad. But so I actually started I started knowing nothing, as we all do, after I graduated from Stanford, and I went to a place called Interval Research, which was a sort of think tank, a technology think tank, and I learned basic research there. And I really didn't even know what it was, but they were doing this really amazing ethnography and all this stuff that I look back now and I just realized I didn't appreciate nearly enough. But I was there, and then suddenly it was the mid to late 90s, and the internet came along, and I realized that I had to learn to code because that's what all the cool kids were doing. And so I learned to be a front-end engineer, was at a couple of startups, and had a couple of exits that were not, they were good, but I'm still working.
Right.
So yeah. But I sort of fell in love with startups, right? Because the late 90s was a great time to be in startups. And then after the boom was over, I realized that maybe I didn't actually want to continue being a front-end engineer forever. And I got into user experience design because I realized that the part of front-end engineering that I loved was the part where I got to see people using the product, and I got to make things that people liked, and it was just a really remarkable experience. And so since I knew how to code and I knew how to do user research, I joined a little consultancy where I learned the rest of it, and it was a really good way to learn, actually, sort of apprenticing. And from there, so I did that for quite a while, and then I decided that I missed engineering because I get bored very easily, apparently, and I went to InView as both an engineer and a designer, and I got to work with Eric Ries, and this was sort of while he was coming up with all the lean startup concepts, and I got to see all the stuff that they were doing, and I got to start measuring the stuff that I was designing, and that was just, for me, that was amazing. That was I always feel like I overhype this, but I'm like, no, that was transformative. Because all of a sudden, like I'd always done all this user research. I'd always gotten to see people use the product, and that was always a very exciting thing for me because I could see how people's behavior was changing with the stuff that I was making, and that was wonderful, you know, with like the 5 or 10 people that you'd end up talking to. But then I got to see the metrics, and I got to see, wow, we made more money because of the thing I did.
Right.
Or people were happier because of the thing I did, or people stuck around and used our product more, or didn't have that horrible experience, or you know, that thing that I did. And sometimes, well, the thing that I did nothing. Right. That was also helpful, right? And I think I really, at that point, started to become a better designer. And so after that, I started my own I started Users Know, where I went and tried to help other startups become that. And now I am at Tradecraft, where I am designing designers.
And speaking of apprentices, you want to tell people that might not be familiar with Tradecraft?
Yes, and I have a few Tradecrafters here. There's one.
That's huge.
There's 3.
There we go.
Awesome. We're up in San Francisco, so you know how hard it is to get anybody down here from San Francisco. I mean, I was excited that I got these 3.
That's great.
I'm like, yeah, all right, good job, guys. But yeah, so Tradecraft is a program. We are actually a startup, and we are training people how to be user-centered designers, growth people. We don't want to say growth hackers, but growth people, and sales and BD. So sort of the traction part of startups, not the technical side, but the traction part, the stuff that you have to know in order to actually, you know, build a product, get customers, you know, get people on board. And it's really exciting. I get to meet all sorts of people who are wonderful at what they do, and they're transitioning and becoming user experience designers. And yeah, and I also get to work with startups who are using the junior designers to work on their products.
Cool, great, cool. Well, I can totally relate to that epiphany, because when I was at Intuit, I worked on Quicken, which was a desktop product, and we would do the qualitative, no quantitative, because you ship it off in a CD-ROM.
It's in a box.
And then I went and we launched an online brokerage, and literally the day after we launched, it's like, oh, 500 people signed up. And then it's like the next day, I wonder how many people signed up today. You can see the data, and then you start going, let's slice that data. And so totally it was like, no data to data was from the web. The web basically empowered that. So,
yeah, it's remarkable. And you know, we say that the web empowered that, but realistically, the web was around for a long time before most people were doing anything with that.
That's true. That's true. Cool. Okay. Why don't we start off with? So I think one of the there's a lot of terms, but lean UX is probably like the most popular term in this area. And you're like the lean UX expert. Lean UX is in your book a lot. Could you just like give people that may not know what lean UX is just a quick overview of what it is?
Yeah, I like to give this explanation. Lean UX is UX that is performed in a lean startup environment. That is it. No, I mean, because I think that there's actually a lot of sort of hype and nonsense, honestly. You know, that lean UX means just throwing things against the wall, or lean UX means we're just going to test our way to success, or lean UX means no deliverables, and all. No. Lean UX is basically user-centered design and customer development performed quickly, and not always as quick, not just quickly though. It's performed iteratively and in sort of small batches and with lots of testing and metrics around it. So if you think about the build, measure, learn loop that's in the lean startup, right? There's this build, measure, learn loop, and we do all of that. We build things and we measure them and we learn them. And a lot of times, the thing that I think user-centered designers have to get their head around with lean UX, the big difference for them, other than the metrics and actually measuring what they're doing, is that sometimes you're not designing an interface, right? Sometimes you're not designing a product. Sometimes you're designing a test.
Right.
Sometimes you're designing an experience. Sometimes you're designing whatever you're designing the smallest possible thing that you can design in order to learn the thing that you need to learn. And sometimes that's a prototype, and sometimes it's a wireframe, and sometimes it's a concierge test, and sometimes it's a landing page, and sometimes it's an A/B test, and sometimes it's throwing something out there and just getting the metrics. Right. But it's not always any one of those things. And I don't like people to get too hung up on the tactics without understanding the strategy, which is really kind of like, the scientific method.
I see a lot of that. You see a lot of misinterpretation. Like I remember I was giving a talk and someone was like, oh, you mentioned Photoshop. You don't do Photoshop in
Oh,
Lean
no.
UX, right? It's like, well, you might.
Yeah. You know when you use Photoshop in Lean UX? When you need it.
Right, exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah, when you need
Exactly.
it in order to learn what you need to learn,
Right.
because it turns out that Lean UX doesn't mean not pretty UX.
Right,
It could be beautiful if you need it to be beautiful.
right.
It could be pixel perfect if you need it to be pixel perfect. I think that what we're trying to get away from, I think that, and I'm a huge fan of user-centered design, and I've been doing user-centered design for many years, and this is the negative thing that I will say about it. It can be practiced in a very dogmatic way. It can be practiced in a very like, this is the method, right? And we always do it in this order. And this is how it works. And I think that Lean UX is just we're a little more scrappy. You know,
Exactly.
we come out of startups, like we're like, yeah, if you need that tool, we're going to use that tool. And if you don't need that tool or if you don't need that deliverable, we're not going to make it. We don't like waste. I mean, a lot of the whole Lean methodology, right, it comes out of eliminating waste. Let's not do stuff we don't need.
Right, totally agree. Yeah, for me, I mean, it's like I practice user-centered design too. I'm like, this is really similar. It's just be smart, scrappy, and iterative, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so.
Yeah, and measure.
Right, and measure. Right.
Always
Cool.
measure.
Okay, so if someone like heard Lean UX and they heard Lean Startup, like what would you say is like, if you had to differentiate those two concepts, like what's the key differentiator?
Well, Lean UX is it's very much the user experience part of it. We don't get as much into things like the Lean business model canvas.
Right.
We should understand, everybody at a startup does every job, so, we should understand the strategy, we should understand what's going on. But there is a huge amount of Lean Startup that is very much about validating your business model. And, you often will use user experience techniques to do that, but if you're going in as a user experience designer at a Lean startup, that stuff's generally done by, the CEO or, whoever the founder is.
Right, gotcha. Okay, cool. And I guess before we move on, what are some, you see a lot of startups, what are some of the top mistakes you see people making when they try to apply Lean UX?
Mostly just using the tactics, or the other thing is just fundamentally misunderstanding what it is. I always say that Lean, like the Lean methodology, Lean startup, tends to be faster and cheaper than waterfall. But being faster and cheaper does not make you lean. So just not spending money on design or not spending money on sodas, I don't know, like not spending money on X that has nothing to do with whether or not you're lean. But it is a little confusing because I think that when you are constantly iterating and when you are eliminating waste, things do tend to move faster and they do tend to be cheaper because you're not spending 9 months building something that nobody wants. Hopefully, if you're doing it correctly. So I think that's a big mistake that people make, is that they're like, yeah, we're lean, we're skipping a bunch of steps. It's like, well, no, but to be lean, you gotta have a hypothesis, design a test to validate it, move on.
Right. Okay, cool. Great. And then I guess we can switch over to talking about, so say you're a startup or you're an entrepreneur or somebody and you have an idea for a customer problem or need that you want to address. Before we even getting into like how do we design the user experience for it, what tips do you have for people how to like validate whether or not this is even something worth working on?
So the way I always think about it is that you need to validate your problem, and you need to validate your market, and you need to, or your users, right? And you need to validate whether or not your solution is the right one for that problem. Because I always say, like, you can pick a problem that's really well known, right? You can pick a problem like, I guarantee you, there's a huge market for this. If you were to say, hey guys, who's got the problem that they'd like to be in better shape, right? Absolutely. Like I would like to get into better shape. That is a problem that I am not in as good a shape as I would like to be in. That's great. There are a lot of solutions to that problem, most of which are really unpleasant. Right? Most of which I will not pay for. Right? In fact, many of which I will pay to avoid. So just because I validated the problem exists doesn't mean that my marathon training kit is for everybody who wants to solve this problem. So you have to validate that you have your market, the people that you're talking to, have the problem. Like, are you talking to people who actually have this problem, that they're not in as good a shape as they would like to be? Yes. Now, is your solution the right one for them? And you can do all of that, or you can do much of that, before you build stuff. And what we do is we often call this, we often talk about testing the riskiest hypothesis or testing the riskiest assumption. So figuring out, like, I'm assuming that there's a big market of people who would like to be in better shape. That's not a particularly risky assumption, right? But it might be a risky assumption to say, well, but I could develop a pill that you would just take once a day and it would make you in great shape, right? That's a very risky assumption. I should test that. I should see if I could actually make that true before I go out and market it and sell it to people. So you need to figure out whatever the thing is that's most likely right this second to kill your company. Figure out a way to test that and mitigate that risk.
Okay, sounds good. And then there was an interesting quote in one of your recent articles that I saw got retweeted a lot, which starts off by saying, nobody cares about your product. Sorry, nobody cares about your product.
Nobody cares about your product.
Yeah. Fundamentally, what users care about is themselves.
Yeah.
And I know you said it that way to kind of get people's attention. You want to expand a little bit on that?
So there's a great concept that I did not make up, and it might have been Kathy Sierra. It's awesome. That this idea that people are not buying your product, they're buying a better version of themselves. Right? That they don't want, nobody wants to use a product really. Very few people. There are a few sort of product fetishists, but like in general, most people don't want to use your product. They don't want to like play with the drill that they just bought and figure out, like, they don't want to spend a lot of time with it. What they want to do is they want to drill a hole in something. Or they want to hang a picture. Right? They bought it for a purpose, and they want to use it for that purpose, and they want to spend as little time with it as possible so that they can get on with their lives and do things that they actually enjoy doing. Now, the one place where this kind of isn't true, people are like, well, what about games? Well, games are kind of different, and in fact, honestly, many games, the reason people use them is because of, chemicals firing in your brain, but but leaving aside things that are specifically just like, things to take up time or, reading books or whatever. Most products that people make are things where I have a goal for using them, right? If you're going to use Medallia, right, like your goal is not to use Medallia, it's to make your customers happier, right? Your goal for using usertesting.com is not because you love testing things, it's because you want to get feedback on your product. Right? In order to make it better. You have a goal, you have a purpose. And the less time you can spend doing that, the better.
Cool. Yeah, and I like how in that article you're like, what about games? You're like, no. And the other one you're like, what about B2B?
Yeah. Oh, B2B is the worst. I mean, B2B is I won't say it's the worst, it's the most of this, right? Like, these people, like, they're doing their job. Like, if you make a B2B product, like, I want you to think about the person who goes to the office every day. And like, what is that person thinking, right? Like, she's got a boss who's like asking her to do stuff, and she's got a million products that she has to use, many of which don't work that well, and they don't work together, right? And she's got coworkers, and she's got meetings that she has to go to, and she's got something that she's got to deliver by 5 o'clock, and then she's got to go pick up her kid. And like, you've got this product that you've just put in front of her, and you're expecting her to like spend time exploring it. Do you know what she would rather do than explore your product? Like literally anything, right? She would rather get a promotion, or she would rather, show how great she is at her job.
Play Angry Birds.
But or play Angry Birds, right? Yes, because games. Yeah, and I want people to think about the fact that, like, I know you love your products. I know that your products are your babies. I know that you go to work and you think about your product every single day, but I want you to think about how little you think about every other product you use. People a lot of times will say, like, oh, what's your favorite mobile product? And I'm like, the ones I don't remember using. Like, the ones that just work and just do the thing I want them to do, and then I can get on with my life. Right?
Cool. How many people have heard of the jobs to be done framework? Anybody? Few? So increasingly you're seeing that coming up, and like I know Clay Christensen kind of popularized it. There's a guy, Tony Olwick, that actually wrote about it like even before that. It's a really thin book called What Customers Want, which is also on my top list of books. And I don't think it actually says
fiction.
Yeah, I don't read fiction. I don't.
Yeah,
sorry,
that explains it.
Exactly. I just watch on TV. So you read it, I watch it.
Yeah, that's right. Have you heard of Game of Thrones?
Yes, I have. Yeah. We won't out you which incredibly popular HBO show you don't watch in Silicon Valley.
Does it rhyme with Silicon Valley?
It rhymes with Silicon Valley. Yeah, she's super busy. But anyway, And it's just so have you seen? I just start to hear more of it starting to percolate. It feels like it's starting to come up when people are kind of crossing it over with Lean Startup to get at this thing of like, hey, they're not hiring your product, they're hiring. They're not getting your product. They're focused on what those jobs or benefits are. So,
yeah. I mean, and I think that this is really something that I won't say that it's exactly like anything else, because I think that often happens when we don't fully understand the methodology.
Yes.
And I will be honest, like I've heard of jobs to be done. It seems like a really good idea. I've read a couple blog posts. I don't know as much about it as I could. It sounds to me like a lot of like stuff that we've been saying about user research and user-centered design. I'm sure that there's more to it than that. But yeah, no, I mean, anything that gets into the world, this idea that products, by and large, are like the actual usage of products. Purchasing products, a little bit different. But the actual usage of products should be not something that we have to think about or that we notice a lot. That products that just kind of disappear or get sucked into our lives in this really natural way are just better.
Cool, okay. So let's assume we've got some good problem, we validated the market, now it's time to sit down and design some concepts. And I've heard from a lot of people that is the kind of a scary hard part is when you first try to come up with it. So what advice do you have for people on how to approach creating that first new design?
And this is, so you know what you're solving for the people, and okay, so I have something I call design stories, which are not user stories, because user stories are specifically an Agile thing, but design stories where you're literally, and I didn't come up with this either, but you're literally going to sit down and you are going to think through all the different, like what do you expect users to do with your product? Now, what do you think users might do with your product? You're going to go through all your main sort of flows and all of your main use cases. Then you're going to go through all of your alternate use cases. And you're going to really think through, okay, what's the user's intent here? And then you have to think through, okay, how does that happen? What are the actual steps? And there's lots of ways that you can do this. I mean, whichever way you're most comfortable. You can storyboard it. You can literally like role play it, with one person being the product and one person being the user.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's kind of fun. If you're into that kind of thing. You can, if you like task flows, as I do, you can make sort of a task flow of these are all the user states that somebody might go through. I think whatever you do, and this is, by the way, everything I'm saying right now assumes that you have done a lot of user research and that you are not making these things up, that you actually know that these are things that people might want to do.
We're lean, so we're skipping research and just going straight to this, right?
End
okay. It's about the tactics.
It is. Anyway, so, but yeah, there's all these different ways. The most important thing is that if you start design by sitting down and drawing a box, you are going to then probably go through what I go through every time I look at a blank page, right? Or an empty box. Just go, I don't know what goes in this box, right? And if I were to put some elements into this box that is, phone shaped or tablet shaped or web browser shaped or kiosk shaped, if I were to put some things into this box, I wouldn't have any context for understanding whether I had the right things in that box or whether they were grouped correctly, or whether they're like I don't have any way of doing that. You need to not start from the screen. You need to start from what I call sort of the context and the flow, right? You need to understand what users are planning to do, and then you need to understand what user states that represents. So the example I always use is something like comments, right? So you're designing a comment system. You have to think through, like, okay, what are people going to do, right? Like, they might come to a comment system. They're going to need to type a comment. They're going to need to submit it. They might need to delete it if it was a bad idea, right? Somebody else might need to report it, right? Somebody might want to reply to it. Like, you have to go through and like really list all those things out. And once you've listed all those things out, this is the thing that my Tradecraft students always tell me after they have resisted all of my efforts to get them to write design stories, and I have finally broken them down and made them write design stories. Tell me if any of this is not true, guys. Finally, they break down, they write design stories, and then they say, oh, it was really easy to do the actual interface after that, because I knew what went in there. Oh, I need a place to put in the comments. All right, that's a box. or whatever, I got innovative with it. And so that's, I think, the part that's missing for most people, is that they try to go from concept to picture, and that is so hard. That's an advanced move.
Yeah, unless you have all that other stuff in your head, which you probably don't. So that's awesome advice, and I like that term called design stories. That's awesome. That's cool. It's almost like, in my mind, you can map it and say, okay, this text box, that maps to the design story where they need to type in. Like, you can map the user elements.
And
elements back over.
And the great thing is, when you've actually got your interface, you can go through the interface, and what I like to do is I like to mentally interact with every element in my interface. Where it's literally, like, I will go through and say, okay, that's a button. That's an interaction element, right? It's interactive. What happens when I interact with it? What are all the possible things that could happen? What is my intent when I interact with that button? Well, my intent when I interact with that button is to submit that comment. Now what happens?
Right.
Where do I go? Where does the comment go? What other task flows are kicked off? Does somebody get an email? Does it just get posted? Does it go through some kind of system to see if I'm selling Viagra? Like, what do I end up looking at, right? What is it, how do I get all the way through from my initial interaction all the way to my intent? And in that way, you're gonna find all of those edge cases and corner cases that designers should love so dearly, because what I have found is that the more of those that you can find during the design process, the fewer times you have angry engineers calling you at 10 o'clock at night saying, you didn't account for this case.
Right.
What happens when they do something complicated? And then you have to think about it at 10 o'clock at night if you are stupid enough to answer your phone when the engineers call you then.
That's what we call the happy path. Right.
Right.
So actually, first off, it's just you're saying there's a static. What is a static? And someone didn't think. So she wrote an awesome article. I just call it the What Next article. The title's something else, but inside it's like What Next. And I feel like it's the 5 whys. It's like the 5 what nexts. Okay, you push the button, then what? Then what? Then what?
Yeah.
And so it's almost like you do even if you did the design stories, then you came up with a static wireframe. It wouldn't necessarily answer what's next. And then the next level would be the happy path, and the next level would be what about all the edge cases?
What about the alternate path? Yeah. What about the not so happy path? What about the slightly rainy day path? And what? And then what about when something terrible happens? And I will often call it everything up until the meteor strike, which is sort of like, okay, what happens if the user is using it and a meteor strikes? And I always kind of laugh, like, okay, maybe you don't have to actually handle that one. And then I realized, oh, I think Google's actually got that covered.
Yes.
Like, Google actually does have to think about what if a meteor strikes their server center. Like, somebody has, or one of them, right? Somebody has thought about that scenario, the meteor strike scenario. So
business continuity planning.
Yes, exactly, right?
So first world problem.
Yeah, it is, right. So maybe if you're a startup, you don't have to worry quite to the meteor strike. And sometimes, honestly, like, you're not going to take care of every corner case and every edge case, but you should know which ones you're ignoring, and you should do it in a smart way where you're making conscious choices, because otherwise it's so easy to end up with, like, dead ends in your product, or terrible interactions, or emails that go out with no call to action, or things that you're asking people to do where then there's no way for them to do it.
Right. Yep. Cool. All right, so let's move on. Let's assume we've done our awesome design stories. We've got some good sketches, and now it's time to like create some artifacts that we can test with users. And my observation has been in the last 6 to 8 years is before kind of the efficient frontier was like flowcharts plus some omnigraphical Visio wireframes with some annotations. Mm-hmm. And now my sense is we've got the new bar is clickable. Tappable, clickable wireframes, prototypes, things like Axure, Flinto, and things like that. So
HTML, JavaScript, CSS.
HTML, JavaScript, CSS, sure, yeah.
For those
so what are your thoughts on how that's evolved and what the tools of the trade are?
So here's the way I look at it. There is, much in the same way that there is low fidelity to high fidelity, meaning no visual design to perfect visual design, right? There is low interactivity, prototyping or wireframing, all the way to high interactivity, prototyping or wireframing. Let's just call it prototyping for now, right?
Yeah.
So at the low interactivity, there's actual paper, which I do not feel like I learn very much from, and I do not encourage it. But that is the lowest interactivity. It is very hard to interact with a piece of paper in any way other than using it as a piece of paper. So there's that. And then all the way at the other end, there is essentially something that is as close to as interactive as a product as it could possibly be, right? It might even have a database on the back end. Like, people can actually use it and interact with it as if it's a product. And we've all used this, right? And your job as a designer is to pick the level of interactivity that you need in order to learn what you want to learn. So for example, if you want to learn whether people can sort of generally understand the messaging and what the purpose of your product is, you can have a static screen. You can have a static wireframe in something like Balsamiq or Omnigraphal or whatever you want, right? PowerPoint. Yeah, you can just, if you have a screen, you can have 15 of them and you can test those very nicely and see, do people get my messaging? Do people understand, right? All the way up to, I have an incredibly complicated and, product where I need to see if people can use it with their own data, and it's very interactive, and depending on what they do here, something else is gonna happen. If you're prototyping something like, for Intuit, like for prototyping something like Quicken, right? And there's a lot of different things that could happen depending on what you put into it. You might need something that is fully interactive, or at least pieces of it are fully interactive, in order to test, like, okay, well, let's check to see if people can actually process their payroll, right? There is everything in between. And there are, things like Balsamiq are to the point where, you can sketch in them, and then you can make it so it's clickable and people can actually kind of click through. And then things like Extra, which are, highly interactive, and you can really get the feeling of using a real product. So I don't like to think of it anymore as this binary, there's wireframing and there's prototyping. I like to think of it as the spectrum, and all of the tools that are at your disposal. That said, I sketch in Balsamiq and I prototype in HTML and JavaScript.
Gotcha, yeah.
That's what I do.
And I feel like
do what you like.
That's a good framework, because at other points, and I feel like new tools come out and they kind of make a new efficient frontier for that level of interactivity or fidelity. Are there other tools like that are popular?
There's tons of them, and I don't. So a lot of my students use InVision. I've seen some people using Proto.io and Fluid, and a lot of people now are using Pop app, which actually lets you take pictures of sketches and hook them up together. So that's a way to do your little paper prototypes, but actually get them onto a phone and test them on a screen, which I think makes them much easier to test. So yeah, there's a huge and I almost hate talking about them because there are so many, and I don't use them because I have my tools. And my tools work for me. I would say you probably don't need a dozen of them for you. You need to find the ones that work well for you, and I would say that you should have one that is very easy and very quick, whatever that is, and that you can throw together those sketches, and you can do a dozen of them, and you can just churn them out. And you should have one that is harder to use, that you spend some time with, and that you're good at, and that you master, that really produces those high interactivity things.
So like one lo-fi, that's quick, one hi-fi, and kind of thing, right? I agree. Just to highlight a couple more, so InVision, and I think what's important is less about the tool and more about when that tool came out, what kind of new capability did it add to the ecosystem that didn't exist before? And so I think, in my mind, when I first used InVision, it's pretty, how many people have used InVision app here? So it's pretty cool because in the old workflow, you'd end up, you'd have wireframes, and then you'd end up with, you'd throw it over the visual designer, and they do high fidelity Photoshops. And they might send you a zip with 50 Photoshop files, and you have no clue which page connects to which or whatever, right? The cool thing about InVision is you can take however you produce your images. I mean, you can even take Balsamiq, you can take a picture of this, you upload it, and then you just create little click spots, little hot spots. You say, if they click here, that goes here, and it goes here, and it goes here. So it's a way to take what would otherwise be a non-interactive, whatever level of fidelity you have, and just make it interactive in a browser so it feels more prototypical too. And the other tool you mentioned is incredibly popular too, is down at that lower end is pen and paper as well as whiteboard. So a lot of times what people are doing for lo-fi is just taking with their phone a picture of what they drew on the whiteboard or the paper, and then using these tools that let them do the same thing as InVision and create little, and actually, you know what? The simplest thing is you just tap anywhere on the screen and it goes to the happy path. It goes down a linear path. So anyway, I think there's some tools.
And like I said, you pick the ones that are exactly right for you. And some of them are very easy to share with teams, and some of them are not. And some of them are very easy to get feedback on from your coworkers and some of them are not.
Right.
And some of them are better with high fidelity if you've actually got some visual designers who want to do some of that and test some of that.
Right.
And some are not.
Right.
So
right. And then thinking about how can I take the artifacts come out of this and test it with users? How easy is that? Right. Same.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I was excited to see when I was researching before this that you've got a video series.
I do.
UX design for developers on YouTube.
Yeah, I always like to say I have a video series on YouTube with the pictures of the skateboarding dogs.
Right.
I am nowhere near as popular as the skateboarding dogs, by the way.
Wow.
Like not even approaching.
I was just like that. It's every 2 weeks, right?
Well,
Roughly?
no.
Okay.
So with Google I/O coming up, they're quite busy making their own videos, so
Okay.
we're on a little bit of hiatus
Okay.
right now. But we have a couple more that are ready to get filmed
Cool.
after I/O is done. And then after that, there'll be a few more. I think that we're probably planning on making 6 or 8.
Okay, cool.
And then if we
Cool.
do well,
You get
we'll get renewed for another. We'll get picked up for another
Season 2. Season
Yeah.
2. Anyway, you
That's
guys should
right.
check them out.
Learning the
because-
lingo.
Yeah, there's some videos of you out there. It's not like tons. So
No, I just have 2 or 3. I think,
Right,
out
and that's
there.
why it's like nice that there's. So anyway, I would check that out. It's on YouTube. It's called UXD for developers. Cool. Let's move on to user testing. So we've got our awesome prototype, whatever fidelity interactivity. You did a blog post on this, but I think a lot of people struggle with, okay, should I do qualitative? Should I do quantitative? What's the right type of testing to do? So maybe we can start out by, for people who may not know, like defining what is qualitative, what is quantitative.
Qualitative is talking to humans, or learning from humans. It's very sort of touchy-feely, observation, not statistically significant. Quantitative is what people are actually doing with your product. So in the real world, how many people are clicking on this button? How many people are logging in? How much money are we making? All of those, metrics and analytics. That's the difference. And quantitative tells you what is going on with your product. Qualitative tells you why it is happening. That is the fundamental difference. So quantitative will tell you 500 people logged into my product and then immediately left. Qualitative research might tell you, why did they go? So that's how we use them together, right? We'll use the quantitative to understand sort of what's going on, what we want to investigate. Maybe the qualitative will tell us, oh, this is what's happening there. Or sometimes we'll do qualitative research to sort of understand how people are using it, and then we'll look at the quantitative data to confirm or to validate or invalidate the hypotheses that we generated during qualitative. We might say something like, based on the research, we expect people to absolutely hate this feature, or we expect people to not be able to find this feature. And then you actually go and you look at the data and you go, oh, actually, people are having a really hard time finding this feature. Yeah, that's good to know. And we knew to look for that piece of data because of the qualitative research.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. And within qualitative, usertesting.com is very popular. Other unmoderated tests are popular. Like more old school UI people are like, hey, moderated tests. What are your thoughts on moderated versus unmoderated qualitative tests?
Well, I will tell you this: no moderator is better than a bad one, because no moderator will lead your customer. So it's a trade-off, like anything. I think if you have the time and you have the expertise and you really need to sort of dig into maybe your users, like you need to learn about your users, not your product. You're not doing usability testing. You're doing sort of ethnographic user research. I think you got to go moderated, right? I think if you're trying to get information about the usage of a particular feature in a product that is on the web or on mobile, I think doing something unmoderated often gives you a lot of the feedback that you need. What I will sometimes do is I'll start off with moderated until I sort of know what to expect, and then when I'm making changes, like I'll make a quick change, and then I'll do a quick I'll do a quick set of unmoderated tests to kind of see, like, did that help? Okay, did that help? And I'll start
for quickness?
Yeah, just for quickness and just for iterating really quickly on. So like, I'll see that there's a problem, I'll make a change, and then I'll launch it, and then I'll sort of, looking at the metrics as well, but I'll also do quick unmoderated studies just to sort of understand, did I make things worse? Did I make things better? It's a helpful tool.
Okay, cool. They're sort of complementary.
Yeah.
And actually, you brought up another thing I was going to ask about is like, do you like to test in waves
Yes.
You know, and if so, like how many people? So people are always looking for specific guidance, like how many people per
5.
wave? Exactly.
5.
5. And how much time between waves?
Okay, again, I didn't make up the 5. It's Jacob Nielsen, he's kind of a god. But that's for usability. Like 5 is for usability testing, but honestly, I have found that it's true for anything because I found that with 5 people, you can start to see patterns or not see patterns. And if you're not seeing patterns with 5 people, then probably your screener's wrong. Like you're not using the right, you don't have a tight enough group of participants in your study. You know, you're testing just 2 wildly different people. So 5 is good, but when I say 5, I don't mean 5 ever. I mean 5, fix the problems. Another 5, fix the problems. Keep going, right? And so on.
Rinse and repeat.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. And then there's a spectrum there too, where I've seen people after each user test, they will tweak the prototype, and then other people say, "No, let me wait till the 5 are done." What are your thoughts on which way to go there?
It depends on how bad the problem was. If it's a problem where like people couldn't log in, yeah, go ahead and tweak it. Like go ahead and fix it, right? If it's a problem that you know, like if you see it with 3 out of 3, yeah, just fix it. Like it's not statistically significant, right? You're trying to figure it out. Now that said, I always say that when you recruit 8 people, you're going to get 1 no-show and 1 crazy person. So if you do something based on like sort of general opinions of the first person, you could really be biasing your study, right? You do want to.
I've seen people go say, "Oh, this one should be green." They go, "Make it green." The next guy goes, "I think that should be red." You know, it's like you kind of.
Well, first of all, stop testing button color in qualitative research because just stop it. But like, yeah, if it's an opinion or like, oh, I think maybe you should do this, or like, yeah, just let it go and wait until you see patterns. But like, if there's really like a problem, like you're seeing something and it's just like they can't do something, yeah, absolutely tweak it.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, you have to use your judgment in all of this stuff. You may notice sort of a pattern from me that I'm just kind of like, well, sometimes you do this and sometimes you do this entirely different thing.
Okay. So, I mentioned you're a triple threat, but you said you're not a unicorn because you can't do visual design. Seems that everyone's looking for a designer unicorn, interaction, visual, code, HTML, CSS, JavaScript.
Magical unicorn. I actually like to call them Fabergé eggs because they do exist, but they're hard to find and extremely expensive.
And fragile.
Sometimes.
Need to stroke their ego?
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, if someone is, has one of those areas and wants to branch out, what, I guess, well, let me take this before we get to that. What skills out of that whole spectrum of skills, and we would probably add on user research as well as a 4th skill. That's cool.
Yes, we would.
And that would be qualitative as well as quantitative, which are distinct skill sets. Out of those, which skills do you think are most important that people should focus on?
I'm going to reframe that question.
Okay.
In your company, you need all of those things, right? So if you're hiring for a designer, if you're thinking of becoming in a company, you need to have somebody who can talk to the users and understand, and you need to have somebody who can do visual design, and somebody who can make flows, and you need to have somebody for all of this stuff, right? There's half a dozen sort of roles within this. You will hire some people, somewhere between 1 and maybe, 3. Probably shouldn't be 6 because then it just gets a little unwieldy. But you will hire some people in order to get coverage on all of those roles. So the trick is, when you're a UX designer, is to be good at a couple or 3 sort of complementary things, and then to find the place that has people who have the other complementary skills, right? Like if you're a really strong visual designer, but maybe you're not as good at the user research, find a place with a really strong customer-focused product manager, right? Who is really understands the user and can advocate for the user, and then work together as a team, right? I think people want to hire unicorns because they don't have any of these skills.
Right. No,
and
sure.
they're like, well, what the hell are they doing?
Sure.
What's your job?
Hire the unicorn.
Yeah, is that what you're a recruiter?
Tell the unicorn what to build.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that unicorns don't like that.
Exactly. Okay. Well, just taking a step back and just saying, if someone's earlier in their career as a designer, what advice do you give them as far as developing their skill set, like over time?
Come to Tradecraft.
Right.
Yeah. So I mean, at Tradecraft, we actually do teach I would say get an overview.
Unicorn Factory.
It's not. So I would say do get an overview of the whole process. Understand the whole process. We talk about the broken comb model as opposed to being like T-shaped or V-shaped or whatever. Like you're a broken comb, right? Like you're pretty good at a few of these things, and you understand basically the entire process. So if you understand the entire process and you've got a couple of verticals, you're going to be good. That said, I don't think you can ever go wrong learning how to learn from customers and users, because you will be a better designer. I don't care if you're visual or task flow or whatever. You will be a better designer if you know how to get feedback from people. That is just true. So try that.
Cool.
And it is, I think, a thing that you can teach to most people.
Great. Well, it's funny because you hear about T-shaped designers where it's like you're supposed to know a little bit of everything and go down one vertical.
It's super deep.
Right. And then the next iteration went up, and that was pie-shaped designers, like pie, where you're down to 2. Yeah, you got broken combs. You have a lot of little ones?
Yeah, and I think broken comb is sort of better for startups because it allows you to have fewer, and also startups tend not to be siloed, so T-shaped is the kind of thing that you want to be if you're a good company, where it's like, you are a user researcher, and you do user research, and you will never meet the visual designers, right? Like, then, yeah, T-shaped, absolutely, right? Like we don't let you talk to the engineers, we keep them in this locked room.
Right.
For startups, where everybody's kind of like, today I'm writing a press release. Oh, that's nice. Today I'm making a Volsemic mock-up, right? Like, you gotta do all of this stuff, right? Broken comb is just better. Okay.
And just, I think it'd be great for people to hear, like, if you have any favorite books or blogs or tips for them to kind of learn from. Like,
there's this great one called UX Release. No. Yeah.
We're giving away
also Game of Thrones. Read the books. And, but other than that, I just got a review copy, because I get those, of Cindy Alvarez's new book, for customer development. That's right, and it is sitting on my table because it came last night. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I will tell you, every time I read Cindy Alvarez's blog, I think to myself, well, I'm glad she wrote that because now I don't have to. Like, there are very few people where I read their blog, like, it never enrages me, and I generally agree with all of it. And hers is solidly in that level. Teresa Torres has a nice blog on product management called Product Talk. Yes, Teresa. Yeah, she's awesome. And so for product stuff, I think they're fantastic. And then there's like all the usual suspects. The Kissmetrics blog is phenomenal. You're having Heaton talk. I mean, if you here's the deal. Follow Heaton Shaw on Twitter. Don't worry about ever finding good content again.
Yeah, that's pretty much true.
Just read everything he sends out, and you will be fine.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. Heaton Shaw, another unicorn factory. All right.
Yes.
Cool. All right. So last topic, and then we'll open up to questions. Was talking about Agile and working with developers, and there's a lot of stories out there of designers having trouble figuring out how to effectively work in an Agile environment and get in sync and integrate with the workflow. Have you ever seen that happen?
No, never.
Okay.
No, that's totally unlikely. So design smaller things. I think one of the things, and this probably comes out of user-centered design, where we want to do like 6 months of upfront research, and then we want to design all the things. And in that case, like the engineers are going to get a little restless, and they're going to be like, "Where's the stuff I'm supposed to build?" So if you think about, if you concentrate on always building the next smallest possible thing that you can design or build in order to learn the thing that you want to learn, or what's and again, you're not designing something crappy. You're not doing a bad job. You're not skipping steps. You're just designing sort of a smaller piece of things, and you're then learning and you're iterating and you're iterating on that, and you're making it a little bit better and you're making it a little bit better. It makes the loop tighter, and that helps a lot. The other thing that I will tell you is understand enough about engineering and engineers so that you understand your tools, right? Architects should know about things like what kind of wood to use and what kind of stone to use, right? Like, they're not just drawing pictures, they're like building houses, they're planning houses, right? They should understand their materials. Designers should understand the materials that are being used to make the stuff that they are making. I don't care if you know how to code. You don't have to be an engineer. You don't have to make HTML wireframes. Not important. But you need to understand what you are asking people to do. And you need to be able to have a conversation with engineers where you understand the things that they have concerns about. And when you do that, the engineers will love you. The other thing that you can do is you can provide things to the engineers that really do, you know, when I talked about sort of what next and, you know, thinking about corner cases and edge cases, remember that everything that you are building, everything that you design, everything that you give has to eventually be built by somebody else. Nothing that designers make is user-facing, right? It's a communication tool for another human being. And they are human beings, right? It's a communication tool for another human being who then has to take that thing that you designed and make it a real thing that's going to go to users. So the clearer and more, not complete in sort of the product spec case, but like in the well thought out and the, you know, well understood, the better that thing that you can give them and the easier you can make their job, the happier they're going to be. Also, they tend to like food and booze, so you can always bribe them.
Awesome.
Yeah.
No, I think that's great. I've never heard anyone articulate it that way. It's true. Like, you're doing the design.
Yeah.
And you always think of it like a translation, but it's just a human's got to build it, basically. It's like the construction crew grabbing the architect's plans and actually building it.
They are your user.
Right.
That's the thing that I want you guys, like you guys, we always talk about, oh, we have to have empathy for the users, we have to have empathy for the users. Like, okay, yeah, I'm 100% on board with that. Guess who your user is? It's the engineering team, right? Have some empathy for them. Get to know them.
Cool. And you had an awesome tip in a tweet about how to make sure they read your user stories.
Oh, I have all sorts of secrets. Sometimes I'll like slip little things into the, you know.
At the end of it, and they lived happily ever
And
after.
I like to end stories, and they live happily ever after. I actually wrote a blog about something that I like to call piejacking, where I would actually bribe them with baked goods. But really, honestly, it's just about building a rapport, because they're part of it, and also bringing them in and getting their opinions. I think the other thing that, and I think this is totally valid, I think the other thing that engineers get frustrated about is that they just get like tossed something at the end of the process, right? Here, build this, code monkey. Like, that's, come on, right? Like, they're smart people, generally, right? They're probably as smart as you. Like, and like, you don't need, like, they shouldn't be designing the product, right? They've got a job to do as well, but they've got good ideas, and they have insights, and they have things that are harder or easier for them to do, and getting them involved early at whatever sort of stage makes sense, and getting them so that they understand the customer as well, and getting it so that they trust you that you're doing the thing that is right for the user, just goes a really long way to building a good team, right? And a good team rapport.
Might even build your prototype for you.
Yes, they might build your prototype for you, but then that takes a lot of booze and snacks, in my experience.
Cool, okay. Well, that's, I guess the only thing I would say, is there any other tips or topics you want to cover briefly before we open it up? Or?
I'm good, just
okay.
Who's got questions?
All right, let's open it up, guys. And remember, tweeting, if you want to win her awesome book and have, 100 times the amount of wisdom we just covered.
Which is only like 4 tweets so far, I think. Or 4 people.
Really?
So it needs some more.
Okay, it's at Lean Prod Meetup.
Do we need a tweet break?
Yeah, a bio break. So, hold on one sec. Yeah, so everyone got it? At Lean Prod Meetup. Cool. All right, go ahead.
So I guess to your last point about the mock-ups basically being a communication device. Have you experienced companies where the execution layer of that ends up being problematic, and if so, what solutions have you found to help mitigate that?
Can you give me an example? Because yes, but I'm not sure if I'm thinking of it in the same way you are.
That either the fidelity between what comes out from the actual product versus what was contained in the mocks, or interactions
Do you mean that like the mocks and the interactions are much higher fidelity than the final product, or the other way around?
That the final product doesn't sync up to the mocks,
Right.
or that the interactions are problematic and not quite as what was intended.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that absolutely happens. And I think that actually bringing engineers into the process earlier can help with that, because there are things, I mean, I think if you don't, when people don't, I don't want to put this entirely on the designers. Sometimes engineers are under pressure or are not good at creating the kind of interactions that designers have created, or just don't have enough time, whatever. Like, there's all sorts of reasons that this can happen, and those need to be addressed, in the product management cycle. Like, if it's really important that the interactions be buttery, then product management needs to prioritize that and make sure that there's time in the sprint for it, and make sure that that time is actually accounted for, right? So that's a part of it. The other thing too, though, that sometimes it is the designer's fault in that they don't get what's possible, what's trivial, what's literally impossible, right? And so they're designing things that really, like, yeah, we could do that, but it'll take us an extra 6 weeks of, development time. And, a lot of times the people sort of downstream will go, that we don't have 6 weeks of development time to make this slightly butterier. So I think you can end up with kind of a lot of compromises on that. But I think that if you bring the engineers in a little bit earlier, you can start to learn the things that they can do quickly and put in the interactions that are still good, right? Like, I'm not saying like, oh, we're just gonna do the stuff that's easy. I'm saying like, we're gonna find good alternatives that work, that won't take an extra 6 weeks for something that maybe is not gonna move a metric.
Hi. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the sequencing of the event, both in the long term, like the all lifestyles of the product, and also week by week. So where the handing out happen between the UX and the engineer, and vice versa.
So are you talking about like in the product development cycle?
Yeah, I'm talking, for example, like Carbon 9. They do like every week they do a full interaction between writing code to looking at the having at least one user testing and keep going.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so I kind of love. I mean, I love the idea there. Like, I think that's great. They've really they've institutionalized a really tight build, measure, learn loop, which is neat, right? Like that's great. I'm not quite as dogmatic about it that it's got to be like, oh, exactly a week. But yeah, I'm a big fan of having a co-located team that like is a small enough team that you can work together and that you can design, execute, launch, measure the smallest possible thing. And that might be a week. I mean, it might be 2 weeks, right? I don't like it to be a month in startups because a month is forever in a startup. But having that sort of rhythm where you're constantly building something small, or again, designing a test, like not thinking about it just like I'm designing a feature. I'm designing a thing that will help me validate or invalidate this hypothesis that I have, and then I'm getting it out there, I'm learning from it, and then I'm iterating on it. So if you can do that in a week, that's great. I think that's optimistic for some teams, and I think it depends on your product, but it seems to work for them.
And how does it change when you are at the very beginning of the process, like you have just the idea, so you have to go pretty much in the initial design, and when you are actually have the product out and it's...
When you have just the idea, you do not immediately move to design. When you have just the idea, you're at that point really designing experiments and tests and iterating on those. And those might be, I mean, those literally, it might be, customer development, discussions. It might be, trying to sell your product to a potential customer. It might be, a landing page. It might be a concierge test. It might be all kinds of things. But it is not, I have an idea. I'm going to go build a design for a product. So I mean, at some point you do have to start building the design, but hopefully you've been sort of building up and you've been finding what that nugget of the thing is that you're going to solve the problem for. somebody else have a...
Where?
Who's sorry, got the mic?
Hi.
Oh, hi.
I really like the notion of designing smaller things. I've been doing that. But what I find is, at the end of it all, it's kind of hard to achieve consistency.
Mm-hmm.
How do you, from the beginning, do you have a trick that you keep in mind when designing these smaller things that helps achieve consistency?
So for visual consistency, I think establishing a style guide is one of the, you're not talking about
Not
that.
just visual consistency, things like metaphors, usage patterns, things that you may not know you may not know you have this particular requirement because that's a few things later, but then you reach that and that might inform something that you saw earlier.
Yeah, so there's a concept in engineering called refactoring.
Yeah.
Right? And there's this idea that like we're going to write the code that we write and we're going to solve the problem that we're solving right now. And then when we need something more, like we're not going to try to design an architecture that will solve for all of our problems 6 years from now. Or, you know, if we've got 10,000 users, we're not going to build something that supports 6 billion users because really, you know, get a few more first. So I think that you can actually apply that pretty well to design, which is that even if you upfront tried to design all of that stuff ahead of time, you get a lot of it wrong.
Right.
Right? So if you're going to get it wrong anyway, don't do it all up front. When you find that you need that extra metaphor, you may need to go back and refactor some of the stuff that you've done, but that's okay. You can refactor it in place, and you can refactor bits of it, and you can make some changes. And I think that that's, you know, that's a reasonable thing to do, and I think it's a reasonable metaphor for it. But like I said, I feel like a lot of people kind of look at it this binary way, like, well, I could design everything perfectly up front, but it's going to take a while. Or I could design these smaller things, and then like I'm going to run into this problem. But it's like, you don't design it all perfectly up front. You have to change stuff anyway. So I feel like you run into that same problem anyway. You're gonna see that in either case. So I'd rather save the time up front.
Hi.
Hi.
How do you measure long-term behavior in a lean UX methodology?
So you're going to have your metrics that you're looking at, and you're going to look at things like retention, which are longer-term metrics, and that's at a very high level how you do it. You measure the behavior of people over a long period of time, and you're going to measure people in cohorts. So, for example, you need to do these sort of longitudinal analytic studies where you kind of look at like, oh, I did an A/B test back in January of, you know, half the people saw this feature and half the people didn't. And in March, I'm going to look at it and say, well, okay, of the half the people who saw the feature back in January who started off with that, you know, what's their retention look like? What's their monetization look like? How did they do compared to the group who didn't see the feature?
Like low fidelity prototyping, is there a way to do it?
Oh, no. This is all analytics and quantitative. Like you're going to measure long term, you're going to measure, like long term is analytics and quantitative, right? You can make one thing that I'm trying to encourage everybody to do. I want to do a long bets for product strategy. Here's my favorite thing to do. Before you run any kind of test, get everybody involved to write down their prediction, all right? And then keep track of it. You'll get better at predicting eventually if you're very honest about how you did and you actually use that to go back and understand, well, why did I think that crazy thing that I thought before? That was clearly insane and not borne out by the data at all. Why did I think that? You'll actually get better at predicting. But that said, no matter how good you get at predicting, and I'm reasonably good at it at this point, no matter how good you get, you're never going to be perfect. You're never going to be able to guess the long-term effects, you know, exactly of something that you do, which is why we test quantitatively.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I wonder what advice you would give to a UX team who works for a company that does not support user testing. I really use it. $1.1 million a year company to do user testing.
I always wonder if this is a planted question. So I literally get this every single time. It's so funny. I believe I predicted this, Dan. So no, and it's a great question. And honestly, it makes me so sad that I still get this question, because the fact that I still get this question means that those companies still exist. And literally, the answer that I want to give is quit. That is the answer that I used to give, and then I realized that was dismissive and mean, and I shouldn't do that, because I get it, like, you have a job, and it's a good company, and like you have benefits or whatever, like, you have terrible reasons for staying at that company, that's fine. If you are determined to fix the company from inside because you are Don Quixote, and that is your windmill, the trick is you need to make the people in charge understand what they are inflicting on their users. And if they are not sociopaths, which I do not guarantee, they will change their behavior. That is the hope that I have in my heart, and the thing that I have seen happen approximately 3% of the time. But the way that you do that is you literally just, you have to go off and you have to just do some research. Be scrappy. Like, just do it, videotape it, and sit there, like Clockwork Orange style, make them watch it.
Yeah. I have a practical, practical answer for you, because I experienced it yesterday.
Yeah? All right.
I'm doing my own research in the company, and I'm doing it for myself because my boss really doesn't really care about it.
Like I said, be scrappy. Yeah. There you go.
And I think it's very popular. I think it's that's the case in many companies. And I just use user testing for one session, and I paid this $45. They didn't pay me to say that.
There's this great product called usertesting.com where you can, well, yeah, but you show the videos.
Video of the users. Yeah. And my boss realized that he doesn't understand how the users feel the product.
Right.
That's one session, that's it.
Yeah. So, and if the one session doesn't, like, so if you have a reasonable boss who, like, you know, can see one session and get it, that's fantastic. If not, you know, you cut together a video reel, you go through, and but you need to make, like, you need to make them viscerally experience it. Because if they don't, then they're going to keep thinking, like, no, it's fine. Like, it's great. I don't know what these people are complaining about, right? Like, they don't get it. The other thing, actually, that I would say is kind of nice is if you have a voice of the customer meeting where you gather sort of like people who, you know, are actually talking to the user, and you start like getting that data. So, you know, you're talking to customer service, right? And you're actually getting, and you're going through the stuff that customer service is saying, and you're finding things that are like, no, that's actually a product problem. Like, if you can highlight those things, that like, these are things that we're actually hearing from the customers already, right? These are problems that we can solve, and then if you can demonstrate those with some user research, very powerful, because then you can kind of go like, look at this thing that we can actually see people doing. Look at this research that we found. And look, this is actually causing, you know, hundreds of calls a day, or it's costing us X amount of money. Like, if you can start putting a price tag on the things that you are doing to your, I mean, I'm just using these terrible words like inflicting, but what are you doing to them? But it's important that people experience that, and that they develop some empathy, you know, come hell or high water, that they understand what they're doing, because they don't know what they've done.
So I had a question about qualitative data. So it's actually a three-part question. So number one, how much qualitative data should you gather? Number two,
lots. Sorry, that's one.
Right, are there any tools out there that you would prefer when it comes to gathering qualitative data? And how do you actually go about understanding it and analyzing that there's a lot of it?
Lots, yes, and sticky notes. Oh wait, I can go deeper into that. So the amount of qualitative research that you need to do is until you are reasonably certain that you have learned the specific thing that you want to learn, which is a really weaselly answer, but it is the only one that I can give you, because there is no, like, talk to 6 people. I mean, you're going to talk to 5 people at a time, right? But you're going to talk to 5 people, and then you're going to analyze, and then you're going to talk to 5 more people, and until you're seeing patterns, until you know what you want to know. Are there any tools for doing it? Yeah, there's a ton of tools, right? There's usertesting.com if you want to do usability testing. There's, contextual inquiry if you want to do contextual inquiry if you want to do ethnography. There's, there's remote moderated user testing in various different ways. Like there's a million different tools. I use almost all of them, honestly. Like there are 5-second tests, there are all sorts of things, and I can't answer your question sort of generically. I'd have to answer a specific thing for you. And then how do I analyze it when there's a lot of data? I would say that one of the reasons that we end up with a lot of data, that we end up with too much data, is that we're not doing focused tests. Like, you need to focus your tests. We generally, every once in a while we will go out and just want to learn things. But in general, we want to learn a specific thing about a specific market or a specific product or a specific usage or a specific part of it. So if you focus your tests, they become easier to analyze. And the other thing that I do is at the end, I try to have multiple people either in the session or watch the session later. And then after we watch the session together, I like to do a 10 or 15 minute debrief on what we heard. And so we can go through and say, these are the important things that we took away from this test. These are the important lessons that we learned.
So I have a question. So I'm actually the CEO of a company, and ever since its founding, I've been in charge of product development and design.
It's time to pass the baton.
It is really time to pass the baton. And so I have a great engineering team.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I can't seem to get user interface designers and engineering on the same level with our executive team so that everybody feels like they're pulling together. And I wonder what that dynamic is, why there is some side of everybody tries to wrestle away the product from me. I don't know if this, maybe it's much more of a statement in saying, do you have any suggestions for me about how I can hand it over to these two different groups without feeling like they're going to cut the baby in half?
Yeah. So this is going to be super hard. Sorry, there's no easy way to do this. You may be looking for, first of all, if you're looking for a user interface designer, those tend to be the people who actually sort of make the pictures and the layout and that kind of stuff. So you may be looking for a senior user experience person, or honestly, you may be looking for a really strong product manager who is going to be that product person. Do you know a company called Polyvore?
I do.
Yeah, so it's an awesome, I love it, it's an awesome company, and their CEO currently is amazing. I know her and she's phenomenal. And she was originally she was originally a product manager at Google, and she was a big user of Polyvore. And she wrote this letter to the founders, this email to the founders, which was I love Polyvore, here are all the things you're doing wrong. And they were you should come in and talk to us. And then for the longest time, for quite a long time, right, she was the product manager, and she describes it as being sort of a mini CEO. She was I was just the mini CEO, I did everything. I worked with the CEO, and so they had this really tight relationship where it wasn't they just handed over the keys to the product immediately, but she worked with the CEO for a long time, and then when the CEO left, she eventually became the CEO as well, and then was hiring her own mini CEOs and training them. But I think that it may be that what you want is that sort of partner that you can bring on that can be your mini CEO, and that you do the job together for a while. But you got to find somebody really collaborative, and somebody who's into that, and somebody who is willing to do that, and somebody who will do that until you trust them. Because it's really going to be about trust. You are never, and you should not bring somebody in from the outside and just be yeah, go for it. It's your product now, right? You just can't. You got to bring somebody in that you trust. And I think that you work together on stuff. Like right now, I'm one of our clients, that we're working with. Like, I spend a lot of time with the CEO, discussing things that he knows that I don't know, that I need to know in order to make the product better. And he, like, little by little, sort of gives up little pieces of the product. And eventually I will have it all. No, sorry. Oh wait, this is on video, right? But yeah, we're gonna edit. Fix that in post. Okay. But yeah, I mean, it's gonna be all about trust, and I think the way you learn to trust people is by working with them and giving them stuff bit by bit.
Hi. I was curious if you could just talk a little bit more about how you go about validating the problem, if there are any specific techniques or
Yes.
words of wisdom in that area.
Yeah, so there's a video of me online, and it's funny because the still from the video, when you find it, looks like I'm about to do a magic trick. You'll know it when you see the picture of me looking like I'm about to pull a rabbit out of a hat. But it's called Beyond Landing Pages: How to Find Out If Your Idea is Stupid. And it's from the Lean Startup Conference last year in the summer. And I talk about, besides landing pages, I talk about 5 different techniques, so tactics for validating ideas, and there are things like concierge testing, wizard of Oz testing, that kind of stuff. And I mean, validating the problem. The other thing you can do is just solid qualitative research. Where one of the things I like to do is, once you've established your proto persona, once you've said I think my hypothesis is, to use the terminology, my hypothesis is that if I find and recruit people like this, whatever this means, right? With these needs, behaviors, and goals, right? If I find these people and I bring them in, 9 out of 10 of them are going to have this problem that I am predicting that they have. And then once that is true, you have sort of validated your market, and you have validated that this problem exists. You have not validated that it's a bad enough problem for them to buy something from you, and you have not validated that you have the correct solution for it, but you have validated that there is a group of people who have this predictable problem.
How do you validate how big they are, too?
Market research.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, and honestly, to a certain extent, if you're using correct screening techniques, if it's an easy screen, if it's an easy recruit, it's probably a fairly big market. If you're really having to dig under rocks to find these people, it's probably a harder to reach market. Either there aren't very many of them, or they're just hard to reach. And that can be different, and you're gonna have to sort of use your intuition on that. Or I hear there's this thing called market research that can help you with that, but I'm not an expert in it.
Going once. Rochambeau. Rochambeau. We'll take maybe 2 more, and then we'll do our raffle. And then we'll open up.
Do you have any thoughts on what engineering teams should be building to support you?
Everything we ask.
In production, you want to have the capability to run this test on 1% of the population.
Yeah.
Through those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Is there a
Yeah.
list of those?
There is. It's lengthy, and I think that it will depend. I mean, it depends too on what level we're at, right? It's yeah, it's a little tiny startup. So honestly, some of the analytics stuff is not that useful at startups. This is the sad thing, that often when we're very small, a couple thousand users, we just don't have enough people to do the A/B testing and the 1% and all that stuff that we want to do. So that's some of that stuff can wait until you get to a little bit bigger. So what I like to, so for example, I like to have a password protected server where I can put, mock-ups and prototypes and things and share them with people easily, although now I can do that sort of thing with things like InVision or other tools. So, but I'm old school, so that's the kind of stuff I want. But yeah, being able to control a 1% rollout, or being able to set up an A/B test, or being able to, change the messaging on something without having to bother engineers, or having just good sort of admin tools. One of the things that I always encourage designers to do is think of the poor admins and actually design admin tools. You're like, yes, right? If you've got something where you're like, yeah, we might want to change the messaging on this, don't make engineers push that. That's mean if you're going to do it a lot. have some sort of tool that engineers could build that doesn't have to be that hard, that like allows you to do that stuff, right? Take this into your own hands. So I would recommend things like admin tools, because some designers and product managers won't think of those. But if there's something where they're asking you for something and they're constantly coming back and going like, oh, can you give me this data about users? Oh, could you just like, hey, how about we give you a dashboard with that number on it? And you can just hit this URL, right? So, and that stuff's just going to come up as it comes up.
Okay, one last question.
So if you're working on a product which has a similar competing product, and you have like a particular feature that you are doing differently from the competitors, and you think you are better, of course, but how can you validate that with respect to your competition?
Advertise the benefits that people will get from your different way of doing this thing, and see if more people buy your product than the other product. But the only real way to tell if you're better is to test the benefit statement. And you notice I didn't say advertise the feature. I don't never advertise a feature. Nobody cares about the feature. Like don't tell me what your product does. Tell me what your product does for me, right? So advertise the benefits that people will get. Does it like what is better about the feature? Like does it make it faster? Does it make it more secure? Does it make it more interesting? Does it make it more buttery? I love buttery. That's my new term from WWDC.
All right, cool. Well, thank you guys. Thanks to Medallia for hosting us. Thanks to User Testing for the awesome prizes, and thanks most of all to Laura Klein. Let's give her a big round of applause.
Oh wait, I didn't say it was for me. No, it's okay. I'll yell. So I answer all emails. So if you guys have questions that you want answered that I did not get to, Laura@usersknow.com. KNOW, not users. No.